Hey everyone, this is Lori Silverman with episode 12 of Level Up with Lori. My guest today is Lorien Pratt, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have her here. She's going to talk with us about decision intelligence, and the title of our show today is The World is Moving Beyond Data to Decisions, Shining a Light on Your Next Role. And I just want to make certain that I show this. This is her book, and so if you don't have a copy of it, I would love for you to get one if you can see it off to the side here.
That way.
Yeah, which way are we?
I don't know.
How we're facing with each other. So welcome, Lorien. I will be inviting others as I see you. We're on a couple minute delay here. So for those of you who are listening in, I can't yet see you. Oh, I don't know how someone just pulled up on StreamYard, but hi. Usually I see people up on LinkedIn itself, but I'll introduce them as they're coming in. I've got a few more who are here as well. Feel free to introduce yourself, to ask us questions, make comments anytime during the presentation, because that's what this is all about, is having a conversation, which is what Lorien and I will have. So before I get into kind of like kicking things off with her, I just want to give a little bit of a history about how I came to find you. I don't even know if I shared this with you, Lorien.
Mm-hmm.
So about, I think it was like, so what are we in now? May 2020, right? So this had to have been like January 2019. I saw an article, and I don't know what sparked me. I saw an article by Instagram where they made the distinction between their decision scientists and their data scientists.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, this is really cool. I wonder if anyone else is talking about this. And then I found Cassie at Google, and then I noticed that her job title had changed from chief data scientist to chief decision scientist,
Yep.
and that she had been doing some videos on decision intelligence, but it wasn't until I think August of last year when she wrote her article in Medium introducing decision intelligence. And then I went, oh my gosh, there's a whole discipline. There's a woman out there who's done this work. So welcome. I'm so glad to have you with us. And I want to say hello. I'm not getting, folks, this is so interesting. I'm getting everyone showing up on StreamYard today. So Claudia has joined us. Where are y'all from? Shantona's joined us. Karen, my colleague, has joined us. Doug,
Hey,
Jacqueline, Paul Bailing, my friend, Kenya. Wow, they're all showing up on my StreamYard feed. This is so cool. Normally, y'all show up on my LinkedIn feed, so this is quite something that I've not seen you over here, but maybe you'll show up over here too. I'm just going to refresh on my screen here to see if I get a notification. Yeah, we'll see who's here. And if you're all showing up there too, yeah, you're showing up in both places. Oh, this is really cool. This is the first Lorien. It must be.
They upgraded the software. It's a good thing, right?
Yeah, we don't know the improvements that are being made. So there's now an integration between LinkedIn messaging and StreamYard messaging. I'm really excited. So maybe you can take us back, like.
Sure.
Because I know that your fans are with us today, and then there are those who don't know you. And by the way, we're getting someone from Turkey who's with us today. So we're getting people on an international basis. Tell us that story about what got you to say something needs to change.
Sure. So my background is I'm a nerd girl. I have 3 computer science degrees, and I was coding when I was 14. So I'm one of them, right? And I sort of got to this point. I was a college professor, and I got to this point in my academic career where I started to suspect that there was a different world out there, and that perhaps there was a perspective outside of academics. So I did like this major pendulum swing, and I ended up as a market analyst, which meant that instead of being down in the solution space, I was up in the problem space, talking to people who were buying things. And then I had a great opportunity talking to people who were selling things. And so I spent years identifying this mismatch and writing about it. People who were selling things that nobody wanted to buy, and buyers who needed things that nobody was selling, right? So there was this constant dance in these two spaces. And my job was to sit in the middle and write about it and tell the vendors, you know, what they should be what they should be building, and tell the buyers what they should be looking for that was cool and new. And coming out of that, you know, and having had this machine learning and AI and all these degrees and stuff, I started to sort of narrow in on data and AI, and I realized that there was probably a gap there. So I did one of my market research studies, and I had a friend, Mark, and I'd met him at a bookstore,
Mhm.
and Mark and I were talking, and he said, maybe we should start a software company. And so we started saying, oh, maybe we should build this pricing software because somebody said they needed it. So I started my interviews, and nobody wanted the pricing software. So I kind of broadened my questions, and I said, okay, let's get audacious. If technology should solve one problem for you that it's not solving systematically across the world, what would that problem be? And I found like the mother of all, buy side needs that was completely missed on the sell side, that there was this giant white space that basically you had the decision makers up here. And you'd think that as people get more senior in a company, that their decision making would get more rigorous. It's
Uh-huh.
actually the opposite. It's
Yeah.
the other way around. As they get more senior and the decisions are more impactful on lives and on money, they actually get less rigorous because they're further culturally from the evidence and the data guys. And so I realized there was this giant missing stack. And long story short, started Quantellia to try to fill that gap between the data under here and then the decision makers, because there was clearly a missing stack of tech and methodologies and basically the equivalent of software engineering back when we were all coders and we didn't know how to write code that actually met people's needs. That same thing was happening in AI and data and machine learning and those kinds of technologies.
But you didn't call it data intelligence, you called it decision intelligence. And
Decision
that,
intelligence,
right,
yeah.
and that for me is a huge shift in mindset.
Right.
And you allude to that even in your book and in our previous conversations that we've had. So
Mm-hmm.
talk to us about
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean? Like, what does that mindset shift include, and why decision intelligence, not data intelligence? Because I think that's an important distinction.
Sure. So I'll tell the chocolate chip story when you tell me to, because it's a good one.
Oh,
But
go
the
ahead.
high,
Go ahead.
okay. So this is a bit of a tangent, and it'll seem irrelevant at first, but I think it'll help to make the point. It's a fable. A long time ago, in a place far, far away, there's a little village, and on the edge of this village, somebody finds a tree that makes, what is it, cacao beans that you can make
Yeah.
chocolate out of, and somebody figures out how to make chocolate chips, right? Some brilliant chef figures out how to make chocolate and then he makes them into chocolate chips. And people come from far and wide to this town that's just brilliant at chocolate chips. And this whole ecosystem grows up around the chocolate chips. People to store the chips, people to send the chips from one people to other. There's like 12 different kinds of chips. And so, everything's kind of humming along well. And the town grows up and it's like the center of chocolate chips in the whole world. So they start these chocolate chip restaurants, right? and the restaurants aren't doing very well, and some bright spark says, you know what, maybe it's not about the chips. Maybe it's about what people want. Maybe it's about, the whole recipe, and the chips are only one ingredient. And the problem with this was there was this whole existing ecosystem of people who sold chips and who made chips and who sold the chip storage things and the chip chilling things so they don't melt in the sun. And so there was all this pushback. You mean, we can have restaurants that sell things that are meals that have more than just the chips in them. And the chips, of course, are data. And after this like year-long research study talking to people, the recipes and the meals are decisions, because everybody I talked to up here not only said, the data isn't helping me with my decisions, but then they talked about their decisions in a really consistent way. And so, one of our big epiphanies as I was doing this research was, a decision is a thing that has like 6 ingredients and everybody talks about them the same way. And many years later, when I got a puppy and I was training him, I learned, and it's on the C-SPAN show, I talk about this more. I learned that this is just classical operant conditioning. This is how, behavioral psychologists think about the human brain. You're in a situation, like my dog is in the kitchen. There's a stimulus, like I say, sit. He elicits a behavior, he gets a reward, right? And
Right.
so he needs to understand the path between those actions that he can take and the reward that he gets within this environment in which I just said sit in the kitchen. And that's like the most fundamental way that people think, right? And it turns out that's the way executive decision makers, government officials, senior leaders at Fortune 100 companies, they're all saying, like, if I take this action and there's this situation and I might have some data about the situation, I might not, what will be the outcome of that? How will that impact my shareholders, my my impact on the climate, my impact on society and jobs and brand and, all those complex things. So I don't know if that was a little long version of the story, but
No,
that's kind of the
I love it.
origin of the whole thing. Yeah.
I love it, and I think that for me, I want to tease out some of the pieces that you
Sure.
talk about there because I think they're so important. This between this beginning point and this end point,
Mm-hmm.
there's lots of complexity, right? There's this
Right.
is like the world
Right.
is not we it's such a challenge. People would like us to think in the way that in my perspective, the data world has grown up is it's much more mechanistic and closed system. It
Right.
doesn't recognize all of the complexities, but as soon as you shift the conversation to decisioning, first of all, from what you've shared, there's a common language, right?
Yep.
There's a common language between everyone because you said everyone I talked to talked about it the same way. It
Right.
doesn't matter. They all had a common language. But the second thing was that we have it then starts when we start to talk about the decision, a lot of other variables come into play that we might not have seen prior. And
Right.
am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah. And so if you think about it, so let's step back. Why has all the data stuff been successful so
Mhm.
far? It's because we have these automated decision systems. You might call them micro decisions,
Yep,
whether it's program
yep,
trading or serving up an ad on Google. It turns out that same stack that's been really successful at telling you what song you want to listen to or what Amazon book you want to buy can be, if you put some extra stuff on top of it, can be used with these human in the loop decisions, right? Where, PricewaterhouseCoopers called these, big decisions that people make like 2 or 3 times a month, like what should our hiring policy be? What should we do about
right.
COVID safety? Those kinds of things. And the AI and machine learning and the whole data and evidence stack has really been left out of that. I mean, you'd think that with all this great tech, that's being used for Google ads and stuff, that would have made it up into people making these really important decisions that impact lives, but not in a systematic way.
Uh-huh. And something just happened to my screen here that I don't know about.
Me too. Hi from Slovakia.
I know.
Hi from Colorado, Slovakia. I think they upgraded their software and they didn't
I
tell
really
us.
do, and I think that
That's
I don't
cool.
even know what to do about it, but I'm
I
gonna
love it.
click
It's
on my
great.
screen and see if it even changes. There, it
Oh,
goes back to
there it
us.
is.
How interesting.
Hi, Slovakia.
Sorry to interrupt you like that. Um, go back again. I interrupted you in the conversation. You were talking about that these
Sure.
micro decisions,
Sure.
your decisions are split.
Yeah, and let's make it really simple, okay? You've got, let's see, here's the left-hand side. No, for you it's the left. So you've got some choice, like are you gonna, bring 12 employees back to work or
Right,
20 people back to work?
right,
And you're imagining some result of that, like
right,
you want people to stay safe, you've got certain responsibilities at work, or maybe you're running a courthouse, or maybe you've got a city, all kinds of environments. So there's this path from the actions that you're going to take to the outcomes that you want to
right,
achieve.
right,
And what's crazy, and listen, data people, this is really important. People are making these decisions now. They're not waiting for the data to be
right,
cleansed. They're not waiting for the data to be ready. They're not waiting for the science to be perfect. They're waiting. They're just doing it now. I mean, so there's people in nursing homes who have no guidance from the evidence, and then there's the data people who, because we sort of grew up in this, automated fast decision world, we think that we have to cleanse all the data before we talk about the decision, like, because the decision is only as good as the data. No, the decision is only as good as the predictive data that is part of the decision path. So unless you know where the decision is, you're going to be cleansing and managing and spending
right,
all this work getting your chocolate chips stored up where people only want like this much of the chocolate chips, right? And because we've sort of been trained to get our data perfect first, we tend to start with data. And what's changing and what's this new movement, and there's hundreds of people in my book who talk about that, is they're flipping it upside down. You start
right,
with a decision that gives you a real focusing lens on the data, And the data is still important. Don't get me wrong. That's where the
Right.
evidence comes from. It's like the seventh sense of humanity is how we get data, right?
Right.
But if you start with the data and not the decision, you'll end up doing a huge amount of wasted effort. And I've seen this over and over. One telecom client did this, one banking client did this. I could go on and tell lots of stories. So,
Well, and I want
yeah.
to tie it back to some other shows because I know that you've taken the opportunity to listen to some things that we've been doing in our work, and we think very similarly. So, for those of you who may not be familiar, in episode 10, Karen Dietz and I did a show on our methodology for making what we call making smarter decisions with data, which is part of what Lorien's talking about. Is how do you go from data all the way through to action? Because we don't have robust methodologies like that spelled out in organizations, and that's really where I see my kind of legacy. And I think that you've added another piece to this, which is how do we get at the mental models in people's heads, right? Which is really the front piece of this. And I think what you're also suggesting, there's a couple things, is number one, well, I said this in my show with Robert Vane, and he's with us actually today from the UK as well.
Robert.
All historical data right now is suspect. So let's just leave that off the table. So, right. I mean, it's.
Yeah. Because the situation has changed. We're in a black swan or a COVID swan or whatever it is. Yeah.
Well, or for some people, for me, it's not even as a futurist. It's not even a wild card because we knew about it. It's just that no one chose to respond to it.
That's right. All of you futurists knew this was coming. Yeah.
Yeah, we knew it was coming. But there's something else here that you're talking about, which is if I don't figure out, if I've got a group of stakeholders who are invested in making a decision, and like we are now, go back to your COVID example, do we bring people back to work? That might be an executive team who's making that decision. First of all, the time doesn't exist for us. And so how do we help them master the mental model, that which they have access to right now, in order to make that decision? Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, and it turns out it's actually really, really simple. So I'm going to make all of you decision intelligence experts, if I can, Lori, in the next, you can hold me to it, 3 minutes. Don't worry about the tech. Leave the tech on the table, out of the room. Get a diverse group of people into the room. Brainstorm through your outcomes. What are you trying to achieve and when? Okay. And every idea is good. In fact, as a leader of this team, you should say some really stupid ideas to loosen people's brains up. Yeah. We all want to be beautiful and make $1 million and have a trip to Hawaii that the company pays for every 3 weeks. Just something dumb, right? And that will loosen up people's thinking and get them into that creative mode. People will try to say other things. Gently, kindly, respectfully listen to what they have to say, steer them back to, okay, but how does that get us to what we want to achieve? Step number 2, do the same thing with your actions. What are the steps we can take? Because people so often get into sort of this, especially when they're overwhelmed with data and complexity, they get into, what do you call that? Tunnel vision, right?
Yes.
And so they lose track of the fact that there's 12 different things they could do. Everybody's just focusing on this one action because their heads are exploding because nobody's drawing a picture of this. So the next thing you do, and you got to write it down, write down all the outcomes, write down all the potential actions you could take. Make sure it's good brainstorming. Say bad ideas, let people get going. Nobody gets to say if it's a good idea or a bad, well, you can say good, that's kind of nice. Nobody gets to critique anything because that will move all the blood from the creative part of your brain to the analytical part and you'll lose your creativity, right? Do that, okay? Leave the data aside. Don't worry about any tech. Don't read my book. Just do those 2 things, and you'll get a big chunk of the way there. Every single consulting engagement I have had for the last 10 years, they don't do that. And I promise you that list of outcomes won't be anywhere in your data. That's because you know the world, okay? The list of actions you have available, data doesn't capture these kind of system dynamics, these action causal dynamics of the real world. And there's some really interesting history of science, teleology reasons why we haven't studied causal reasoning in this way. And finally, it's coming back. We can get into that if you ever want to get geeky about it.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, science has been ignoring the path from actions to outcomes. Hello, that's the most important thing we do in many cases.
Absolutely.
And yet data is giving us predictions. That's good, but that doesn't have to do with my actions that I can take. Data is giving us facts. We're getting models from, in COVID, we're getting it from Oxford and from, Washington and all these places. But, oh my gosh, I'm surrounded by all these facts and all these models. And yet I have no idea how to assemble that into something coherent such that I know what to do. And then, oh gosh, the situation's going to be different tomorrow.
Yes.
And so it's, and then, sorry, that was 3 minutes. I'll give you one more minute. and then the next thing is draw a picture of it, because everybody's got this illusion, this mythology that we can keep all this in our heads. And it's like we're trying to build buildings without blueprints, or project management without Gantt charts. Hello, can you imagine doing that? It doesn't work, guys. And you can really easily learn to draw a picture of a decision. Read my book for that. And now you're not like trying to keep it all in your head and communicate it with invisible words that are really crap at understanding these complex things, and it's on paper, and now we can collaborate around an artifact instead of arguing with each other.
Absolutely. Well, and what you're talking about, and you've embedded into this approach, is what I call strategic thinking. It's the ability to stay divergent in terms of what you're talking about. It's the ability to entertain a lot of different sorts of conversations, and to see the complexity of what people are talking about. I want to turn to our audience because there's been tons and tons and tons of comments, and I want to read them to you. We've got folks in the UK who are with us, folks in Canada. And I'm going to read you a couple questions from Robert, and I'll link them together, and you can decide if you want to comment right now or what you want to do. He says, has it been successful or just really focused on tiny contexts? Would you agree that you need data plus knowledge beyond data plus intuition to make any decision?
So the simple answer, Robert, is absolutely yes. And again, there's deep neuropsychological reasons having to do with hyperplane separations from training examples that that have to do with why we have intuitions about things we can't explain very well. So just because something is subconscious doesn't make it irrational. And there's massive amounts of subconscious rationality, very roughly analogous to system 1 and system 2 thinking, like Kahneman talks about, and we ignore both of those at our peril. It's almost Jungian, there's the subconscious that we share, and there's good ideas that we can get from that space. And guess what? When you start drawing pictures of it, you're activating, first of all, you're offloading, that whole, getting all the blood that was trying to remember what the picture looked like, and you're getting the blood's free to something else. And then you have the freedom to activate, that deeper intuition side of things. And there's some kind of key principles about DI that help you kind of get to some deep knowledge and some intuition. At the same time, you're really practical, and you're not just ending with a diagram, you're ending up with a software system that integrates with AI and data. I think there's value, Robert, in many cases with a qualitative model that has no data. Simply understanding, there was a lovely little dynamic model in the New York Times a few weeks ago showing COVID, and it was like, simu virus. They weren't even saying it was COVID, but it gave you the intuition about how this thing worked, and that wasn't based on any real data about COVID. So, journalism, what is that supposed to be doing? It's supposed to help us to understand things, right? And not all journalism has data visualizations, right? And what we're really talking about is getting everybody on the same page so they can understand things. But in this world, the thing you have to understand is invisible, it's exponential, it's emergent, it's interdependent, it's global. It sits in a cognitive space that as humans, your head explodes, right? So we need that computer assistant, Janet from The Good Place, sitting next to us, getting us so that we can take all these things that humans are bad at thinking about and making them visible and visceral so that we can move them into a space where we are good at them. And then that drives, back to Robert, your intuition, and then you can pull in data. Really long answer to your short question.
Well, and I concur with where you're going. I've come at it from a little bit different psychological perspective, in that we now know that intuition is a form of data. It's a qualitative form of data from the studies that have been done. And so I think not to pull it in is disregarding the value of the human within this whole experience of making decisions, right? Because it's not about the machine making the decisions, it's about us making the decisions and being enabled by this. But what you're also talking about, and I think, there may be another role here for people who are visual illustrators, who come to meetings and that they could actually help us to visualize these things.
Yep.
And as you're talking, I think to
Yep.
myself, I'm one who uses Post-it notes. I tell people, start doing little drawings even on Post-it notes. Let's move them around. Let's have the ability to reorganize and rethink, and then have these amazing insights that happen because something else is also happening unconsciously. Our human brain, when we start to see things and connect dots in different ways, all of a sudden gets these other ahas.
Yeah, I have a friend, Eileen Clegg, and she wrote a book along with Valerie Landau and Maylin Fun because they worked with Doug Engelbart. But Eileen is a professional visual illustrator, those real-time
yeah,
in-meeting illustrators. And she's been doing a little bit about DI too, but I think there's a whole discipline of how you draw. She just finished a book on like archetypal imagery and how you can use these little symbols that have a massive amount of information as you're drawing these things. And so to do that real time in a decision-making scenario where you're just trying to map everybody's decision models and make it beautiful and have little icons that mean things. Yeah, there's a whole new field, So any artists who like the geeky stuff and want to save the world with COVID, come talk to me, because there is a whole new discipline that's emerging around that. Yeah.
Well, and I think that it's the ability. I'm where you are. If we want to avoid people arguing with each other and having conflict, and these are different people having conflict, let's have conflict with a diagram. Let's have the conversation about it, and let's have our thought be holistic around it. There are some more questions that I wanted to raise here with you. Jenny Barnes, who's also with us from the UK, I just spoke with her the other day. She said, our brains are our first computer and pretty good at processing a lot of data. and others are agreeing with her here.
But let me agree with you on the one hand,
uh-huh.
but on the other hand, understanding exponential curves and actions at a distance, we have sort of reached what I would call a complexity ceiling, where our intuitions are actually taking us in the wrong directions, right? And so, yes, we need to use our brain data, and then we need the computer to help us with it, sitting alongside us. I think it's this intelligence augmentation view, which is where we have to go to use the best of both worlds.
Right, but where you're starting, and I think I want to come back to this because the steps that you've outlined for us don't rely on any facts, figures, evidence. They rely on human conversation, right?
They start with human conversation. If you end with human conversation, you could get led astray.
Yes.
So I think it's important, back to what Robert said, and also agreeing with what Jenny said, that we do ultimately ground what we're doing, but we can get a ways down the path. Just drawing that decision model has a huge amount of value.
Well, and you have some examples of that. I mean, of where organizations didn't do that right up front, and tell us one of those examples.
Sure. So I was working with what was the biggest company in the world at the time, with trillions of dollars in revenue, and they had 53 countries and tens of thousands of buildings, and they needed to change out their phone system, and so to a like IP phone system, and so they started out by hiring a consultant to build this massive data center, and it was huge. There was consultants as far as the eye could see, and they had this big data thing. And only then, after they did that, did they bring us in to say, okay, well, what decision is this supporting? What's the data for? And we came in, and long story short, this giant data set, we trimmed it down to something that would fit within a spreadsheet. And it turned out only a subset of the fields of the data that they'd been cleansing was necessary to solve their problem. And they just drawing the diagram, which we helped them with, to show how the different pieces fit together, like the guys who were, construction on the building, and the guys who were from the phone company who were connecting things, and the guys who were putting the phones on the desks, all these complex things that would normally be project management, but was just so complex that you needed something more sophisticated. Just the diagram, they laminated that and they sent it around, and they said it had a lot of value. And then we went on and built the software system that brought that diagram alive. But it was like this giant data thing that turned out to be, they only needed a few. And gosh, I could tell story after story. Telecom company that did the same thing. And then we came in, we do the decision. It's like, 10% of the data has 90% of the value. if you know what decision you're supporting, right?
Right. Well, and that's what I've been screaming that message for years. You've been screaming it far longer than I have, at least a decade longer. I know you have. But why is it so hard for us? And then I'll take a look at the questions here. Why is it so hard for us to get people to want to do that? I mean, it's when I feel like everything, it goes back to your chocolate chip company. Everything's been built up around these restaurants
Yeah.
that say, well, we're going to use chocolate chips in all of our recipes. And my thought as you were telling the story was, well, what if consumer sentiment isn't even around chocolate chips anymore?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I mean, like, you're still doing it and you're like wondering, where are they out there? But and they may want things in different ways. But
Yeah.
but you've been working on this for what, 15 years, longer probably?
10 or 11.
10 or
Yeah,
11?
started around 29, 28. Yeah.
Okay, so I've been working on it with Karen since about 2015. Definitely not as long as you, but I find that the shift, getting people to make the shift to say decisioning comes first.
Yeah. So the reason for that has to do with technology hype cycles. And what drives the hype cycles is, and I was a perpetrator here, so I can speak to it.
Okay.
Journalists and analysts, it's much easier to get sell-side interviews than buy-side conversations. So if my job is to write about the buyers and the sellers, right, I'll get 90% of the sellers because they have a whole department, it's called marketing, whose job it is to talk to me, right? And the buy side, the people who might buy that, there's nobody whose job it is to talk to me. In fact, that's a risk for them to disclose what their needs are because that explains where their gaps are as a company. So it's much harder to get buy side conversations. So journalists and analysts like myself, we get much more information about the sell side than the buy side. So we end up perpetrating, these feedback cycles, these vicious cycles. So data gets popular. We say data's popular. Oh, and then there's this tactic where people want to market like, you need to buy, a data appliance. So they'll say data appliances are inevitable. Well, most journalists can't tell the difference between inevitable and, actually needed because it's so hard to talk to the buy side to ground whether that inevitability is really true. So what we do is we get in these hype cycles, and that happened in AI. This is the third AI summer I've been through 2 winters now, and they cycle every 10 years. So AI was really popular in the 80s. There was something called the Japanese Fifth Generation Project. There was, millions of dollars in funding. And then, zoom, zoom, zoom goes up the hype cycle. The journalists are promoting it. And then the bottom falls out because people start to have a lot of failures. So back to your question, the reason this is so hard is because all the oxygen in the room is being taken up by data. And so as with me as an entrepreneur, when I try to sell a decision intelligence solution, because nobody's ever heard of it, there's no budget for DI.
Right.
There's budget for data, and there's budget for AI. So I've had to pivot back to my AI roots because I've been building applied AI systems for like way longer than I want to admit, many decades, right? And so because that was at the top, going up its hype cycle the last 10 years, I was able to sell AI systems. And nobody has budget for DI because it hasn't gotten into that thing, right? That hype cycle. But if we can get the flywheel going, right, with conversations like this one and my book and the C-SPAN thing, that's kind of what my mission is, because I'm absolutely convinced that this is necessary. And especially with COVID, where people are trying to make decisions and they're surrounded by all this data and they're lost. There was a quote in Washington Post last week. It says, science isn't doing me anything because science is waiting to remove all the uncertainty, and I'm making decisions now. What can you give me now?
Right.
And he needs to recognize, and all of us in data need to recognize, people are making life-based decisions and trillion-dollar decisions with your crappy data and their intuition. And your data is so much not being presented in a way that's useful that it's mostly, whoever tells the best story in the room. And storytelling is great, right? But it's not always grounded in data. So we need both.
Right. Well, and I think that, by the way, this is absolutely fascinating to me because I hadn't even thought about the hype cycles and the buyers versus and the buy.
That's what causes it. Yep.
And that's really fascinating because what it's saying to me, well, buyers don't want to talk, right? Because why would I want to, like you said, why would I want to elude what it is that I'm doing? That's my strategy. Those are my breakthroughs. Those are my innovations. So I'm not going to talk to you about that. Let me see if we've gotten some reactions to this yet before I go on with this, because I do want to pursue this a little bit more. Anka is asking, as a consultant, how do you help a client brainstorm their problem statement to solve it with data if you're not an expert or SME in their domain? And how do you know when they have a good problem that can be solved with data or AI models? And I'm assuming you have not been an expert in every single organization you've walked into in terms of the business of the business. So
I have been an expert in none of the organizations I walked into. I'm a techno nerd, right? But I've worked on like the Human Genome Project and budgeting for the US courts and like 1,000 different things. So there is a role for a good facilitator, right? And you don't claim to have the expert knowledge. You can do one of two things. Either you depend on your customer to have the experts, because guess what? They've got the skin in the game. So they're going to do that. And it's your job. I remember, again, with this very large company, we did the telecom thing. The first day we showed up, there was like 20 people in the room, and I facilitated the meeting, and they never met each other, right? They were all from these different siloed departments, and they all thought they were like the blind man and the elephant. They were all dealing with the same problem, but they didn't see the whole. And so it was my job to help them get on the same page. And that's a skill that just required me to be smart and not necessarily to know telecom transformation. The other way you can do it is you can get like a team that has a domain expert, and then the facilitator, and then your end customer to do things. And then the book describes, I think it's chapter 5, is like the whole process. If you want to be a consultant in this space, how you do it. Well, or if you're doing internally for your company.
Well, but you and I have been doing facilitation for a lot of years, right? You gain those skills over time. And I think it's really a matter of what's the curiosity and the ability to probe deeply into what people are saying and to understand, again, is how do we help them to express their mental models, and then help them to actually understand what they've expressed. Because oftentimes I find I teach a graduate course in strategic thinking, and we talk about frames and mental models for an entire week. Just because I say something or just because I write it doesn't mean that actually is an expression of my frame. It's because I can look at it and go, that's not what I meant.
So here's something really weird that I'll do, and that maybe your friend is interested in. I don't teach about frames. I don't teach about mental models. Yeah. Well, I do after the fact. But the first thing I do in the room is I say, tell me what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And this is such an intuitive, because it goes back to Skinner and stuff. Because everybody's mental models have this basic structure. I've got this action. It's going to flow through some events. It's going to be informed by some data. It's going to lead to some outcome. I don't need to teach a thing, right? I just elicit their outcomes. And you don't have to put this big barrier of you have to learn my methodology in front of them, because this is probably the most natural. And they're so relieved that somebody finally asked. And then when you start writing it on the board and they don't have to keep it in their heads, it's one of the best. You probably have this moment as a consultant where the whole room just, the tension goes out of the room, and people say, oh, everything I was keeping in my head is now on the board, and I can see how my friends are thinking too. And now it's like the blueprint where, otherwise I had to guess, my electrical system, it run into the plumbing system. It is not going to work with the engineering. And I had to keep it all in my head. No, I have a blueprint. I see how it all fits together. And it's just this wonderful moment. Everybody should experience this when you get that out of their heads, especially if it's really diverse, like old people, young people, different races, different genders. Everybody's coming from a different, somebody in marketing and somebody in engineering. They never talk, right? And that you can get them all on the same page. And that's so cool. It's really neat.
Well, it is. And I think I want to reinforce this for anything in life, because I learned this a lot of years ago when I was writing books on the 7 management and planning tools out of Japan that most people don't even know about today. And one of the things people would say to me was a question exactly like you. Well, how do you teach people about interrelationship diagraphs? How do you teach them whatever? And I'm like, you don't ever say the tool. You don't ever do it. You just ask. You just know enough to ask a series of questions in a kind of systematic order that allows something to reveal itself to people, and then they get into the act of actually understanding what you're doing, and then you can come in and backfill in terms
Right.
of what is it that I did with you if someone expresses an interest, because
Right,
somebody will,
right,
right? Somebody will say, how do I do this with another group? You know,
right.
could you go through this with me again? And so I think that even on a much larger plane, because I'm thinking about things like, you know, the companies today that are teaching 50,000 people how to do agile. I'm like, really? Really? Like, that's going to be the answer to the world's hunger problem? You know, I don't mean to be a skeptic here, but I'm like, it's not about that. It's about the way we think. Because what you're
Yeah.
expressing is, how can we help people to just think better, think smarter, right? So let me see.
Can I just add one thing
Yeah,
before
yeah,
you
yeah,
go to the other
absolutely.
question? Because I know there's technical people on the call. They're
Yeah,
probably thinking we're totally fluffy here. So I
yeah,
just wanted
I
to
know.
say something. Once you've drawn this diagram, that diagram also serves as an architectural diagram for where machine learning, randomized control trials, predictions, and data fits in to the decision-making structure, okay? So you do this fluffy thing, because I used to think of people like that as fluffy, because I was such a nerd, right? So I sort of like imagining how this feels to people say, well, I want to just do my data, do my machine learning, and cleanse my data. So this thing is an architectural diagram for the decision model that then exposes certain API interface points, and it ends up being a really nice way of decomposing the problem into pieces so that you can then introduce evidence and decisions and machine learning and all of that stuff, which is so cool, because the same thing that's like the blueprint also helps you build a system that gets you the simulation that lets you run the forward models. So you have the backwards data and the forward model, and you get the best of both worlds. It's cool.
Well, and I'm going to add another piece here, because this is something I've been saying for years as well. You know, you and I have very different backgrounds, right? I consider myself a nerd too, but I don't have like 3 degrees in computer science, but I'm still nerdy, you know? And
Right.
but my nerdiness comes from organization development, strategic thinking, um, uh, business storytelling, and decisioning from a different perspective. But people like me, we can really help people like you. I
You
mean,
can,
right?
absolutely.
Because I think that's where you and I kind of came to. It's like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, we think the same way. We've come at it from completely different perspectives.
Well,
right?
let me do this picture again. There's been this gap between the decision makers, people at your level who've been helping strategy, and the data side of things.
Yeah.
And what we're doing on this call is we're building the bridges between those two. So it's an integrated architecture. We don't have this cultural communication. You know, these guys don't even speak the same language in most companies. And so that's what's the big, when we can get these two things married together, and you know, there's this missing stack opportunity for technology entrepreneurs, missing stack of stuff in the middle. That's huge. And it's, you know, I truly believe it can create a solutions renaissance, because it solves not just COVID, but climate and a whole class of problems that are exponential, emergent, interdependent, non-siloed, non-linear, vicious cycles, virtuous cycles, system dynamics dominate. There's this whole class of unsolved problems that needs this, and this is the solution to, which is so cool.
Well, right, because what we call chronic problems that people are saying today are unsolvable, but we see the opportunity to solve them if we take a different way of thinking. But I think that, and I'm going to come back to questions again, I think there's a marriage to be made, and it's not being made in organizations today, because people like me with my background, I have yet to find a chief data officer, a chief analytics officer, a CDAO, and anybody, CIO, CTO, you name it, with someone like me with my background, partnered as an equal on these sorts of things, to go through the decisioning piece that you're talking about, so that everybody else can run, and that their efforts, I think what I'm taking away from what you're saying is there's a lot of wasted effort right now, because
tons, yeah.
Right, because people are focused on the language of data. Data is the language, and we're saying decisioning is the language, right? I was thinking about it today. It's really a different language. But it's the language that we all know. We all know it. We don't even have to learn it.
I don't have to teach it to anybody. I taught it. My kids grew up while I was inventing this, and they used to draw little decision models on the car windows with Sharpie, not Sharpies, thank goodness, dry erase markers. So, I mean, this was just natural. They're natives, and you can teach this to 5th graders, and it's very, very natural to them.
That's what I'm saying is everybody keeps saying to me, but you have to teach them how to do analytics. You have to teach them statistics. You have to teach them data science. I'm like,
that's like saying we can't operate our microwave unless we know the physics of the thing that makes it hot. We can't drive a car unless we know how a carburetor works. I mean, anybody in software knows that there's the inside of the box and then there's the outside of the box. And we have not, I mean, if there's one lesson I would give to the data scientists, as you communicate, don't tell a person who only needs to know the outside of the box, the inside of the box. If you're teaching somebody to cook with a microwave, don't tell them how the magnetron works. And that's what's going on systematic. That's Cassie Kozyrkov's example. Credit where credit is due.
Yeah.
Was the microwave thing. So be careful. Don't overwhelm. Don't fill up people's brains with the inside of the box. We're cognitively overwhelmed already. What's the gazintas? What's the gazoutas? And how do you know that it's going to do its job? That's
exactly.
it. And then if you want to get into the inside, that's cool. That's fine. But that's not what's missing. I mean, we're real good at the inside of the box stuff these days, and the outside is what's missing.
Well, because that makes us feel like we have value and we can charge a lot, in terms of
salary. But we've built 3,000 different kinds of car engines, and nobody's invented the dashboard.
I know. But let me share with you the comments, because there's a whole bunch here. Linda Larson, who I think you know.
Linda.
She talked about decision ergonomics. There's analogies to the World War II problems of pilots driving planes into the ground in emergencies. The beginning of designing heads-up display, showing pilots the most important info in the moment in the most accessible way.
Why don't we crash our businesses through simulations, or our COVID decisions through simulations, just like we crash planes through simulations? Wouldn't it be better to learn in a simulation environment where a computer is helping us figure out how actions go to outcomes?
Yeah. Well, and Robert added a comment that I actually, I love this quote. He says, "Data needs a diet." For sure. Robert, I gotta tell you, that's it, right?
We'll put that on the back of my next book. Data Needs a Diet by Robert.
You got Robert Bain. You got to remember that came from him.
That's good.
And then Kenya says, she just said 3 words. She said front end analysis, and I think that's what you're talking about. Is that work needs to?
Yep, Kenya, you're absolutely right. Yep. It's recognizing that if we just start coding, back in the 60s, you'd hire teams of coders and they just start coding, right? And then we came up with, I don't know, requirements analysis and what people need and all of that crazy stuff. And that's exactly what we're talking about. So if I was to make a little quotey pithy thing, I would say, don't do anything with data until you know the decision that it's supporting.
Yes.
Because otherwise you will waste your time.
Yes. And I think that where the challenge is, and I'm going to take this a step further, is you're talking about, I think there's a continuum on rigor. I'll just say that there's, depending upon how much rigor can we put into actually mapping this out versus I've got to do something in the next 5 minutes. And so I think that's where people get confused sometimes. I see the need for rigor. You see the need for rigor. Not everyone does. And decisions are at different levels. There's strategic levels of decisions, operational levels, tactical levels of decisions. But because this is common, if we can get people just to start inserting this into their language, well, what are the outcomes? What are the actions? It's just common daily language. And we start just showing them that we do this anyways in life. And we just start, all we're doing now is we're taking what's implicit and making it explicit.
Yep.
It will become a habit that people will do.
Nice idea.
Paul Bailing says, administration of data can't be the foundation of decisions. Sound administration of data needs to be a result of having a sound decision-making process.
Thank you. You get the other quote on the back of my next book, Paul.
I can spell his last name for you too. Then Robert's chiding you and me because he knows that I've been calling the decisioning work that I do, which we call making smarter decisions with data, falls under what I call data literacy 2.0. So he's going to chide us both now, and he's going to say, where does this leave data literacy? I'm going to say data literacy 1.0, right? Because I'm going to say that
And here's the thing: if we get back to the hype cycle, people are still talking about data, so you got to meet people where they're at. And if they're talking about data today, I think you still need to be saying things. I think I've made the mistake. I was like, decision. And people who had a budget for a data project, I couldn't sell to them, right? Because I was a decision project, not a data project. And so, there is this meeting people with how they're thinking today and where their priorities are. And so I think it's okay to say data as long as we recognize we're talking about chocolate chips and ultimately we're going to need cakes. Well, but, if the whole world is obsessed with chocolate chips for a while, we've got to be real, Well,
and I think it's, most people I don't think here realize I'm a former therapist from like past lives.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a couple graduate degrees too, just nowhere near yours.
It's all coming full circle. You're gonna need it now, Lori, because the behavioral psychology, all the
Oh my
stuff
God. Oh yeah.
comes
Oh yeah.
together in this world. Yeah.
Well, that's why
Yeah.
I say my work is, that when I think in Cassie's article, she talked about decision intelligence being the combination of data science, management science, and social sciences. And I said to you, where is
Mm-hmm.
the psychological sciences? They need to be there
Right.
because there's this huge amount of research and work that's happening in that
Yeah.
area.
And can I say a quick thing along those
Yeah,
lines to
please
make it
do.
really,
Yeah.
again, really simple, because your head can explode. Oh my God, I have to learn psychological science too. Oh my God. Blah, blah, blah,
No,
blah.
you don't.
No. So here's the 10% or the 2% that has 80% of the value. As you're drawing these maps, how do I get my camera to work right? From the actions to the outcomes, I have never seen a model in which there weren't what I call intangible flows. So it's not just money that might, you might influence. It's people's opinion, it's customers' opinion, it's brand, it's happiness of your employees, right? And so those flows might be a little harder to measure sometimes, and you might have to measure them using some instrument like a survey or something, but there's hugely important. In fact, most of the kind of winner take all markets where companies have really dominated, they have both a feedback loop, but there's an intangible flow. They call it, who's it called? Values mapping.
Yes.
I can't remember her name. Anyway, the idea that right in that model where there's revenue and EBITDA and cost, there's also brand and reputation and opinion and happiness. And that those, I mean, look at Starbucks. We pay more for coffee because it feels like such a sense of community going in. Then they reinvest that extra margin back in like education for the baristas so that they're even happier. And they work this intangible feedback loop flow, this invisible engine. And again, if you study lots of companies, you'll see these intangible factors. And to understand that well, that's psychology, right?
Well, I
So
think
it's
that,
not hard. You just got to put the lines in your little diagram that have the psychological flows too.
well, I think what you're saying is
Empathy
don't
too.
ignore those, right? You have to make them explicit, and that the
Right.
intangibles or what might not appear on first blush to be important. Here's, I think, the dilemma. We
Yeah.
are
I have to
in
say
the
something really important about this in a minute. I'm so
okay.
excited. I'll let you finish your sentence, but I'm really excited.
Well, we're in the experience economy, and we're and I don't think people realize that what you described in the Starbucks example. Starbucks has been working on the building of the third place for eons. Oh my gosh, years and years and years and years. They understood that something that appears to be intangible is actually tangible and can be
Mm-hmm.
measured. And I think that we
Mm-hmm.
need to start doing more of that. Years ago, I remember a book being written by Rosenbluth Travel called employees come first, not customers come first, employees come first, because
Yeah,
they
I remember that.
realized,
Yeah.
remember
Yeah.
that they
Yeah.
measured employee happiness, satisfaction, all these different sorts of things, that it had a direct influence. And what you're saying is don't ignore those pieces, bring them in, and bring in
Yeah.
stakeholders into the meetings who have that perspective. I think that's even more important because you could leave
Right.
people out, right?
Right. Okay, so here's a completely radical idea. I just came up with this, and you guys can beat me up on this, but I think it might be correct. Everybody thinks that those who invest in COVID safety remediations, that's so expensive that they'll go out of business. But imagine that you make a big investment, your cash flow goes through the floor, but at the same time, you publicize your commitment to safety. You really take on ownership of this intangible factor that people want to feel safe buying from you. They want to feel that you're an ethical corporation. They want to feel that you're good. Okay. Now you start to you can charge slightly higher prices because
Yeah.
of your brand recognition for doing that. Reinvest that into more safety measures and more promotion of your safety. And then your brand goes a little higher. You can charge a little more. Your market gets bigger. Your pricing gets better, and take that around. And so now what we have is exactly what I talked about, is one of those feedback loops that involves an intangible, reputational, and folks in CSR know this, and folks in some climate stuff know this. It can't be bullshit. Can't be greenwashing or whatever the COVID washing is. It has to be real. But now we have a dynamic that allows companies that take their employees' health and safety seriously to be runaway successes. But it's a knife edge, because if you invest too much or you invest in the wrong thing that doesn't have as much safety impact. So that's where that decision, you've got the list of all this COVID interventions, right? You could do, UV lights in the ductwork, mass campaigns, pod employees, cohorts, blah, 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 blah. And then you've got your outcomes, which is employee safety, meeting my responsibilities to my community, meeting my responsibilities as a business leader. And then the data feeds all of that. That's what I meant to do. I don't know where my camera is. And then the data changes every day, right? Yeah. So unless you have that computer help next to you, keeping track of that whole thing in a decision model, you can't do this. But there's an opportunity. Everybody says it's like a zero-sum game, but no. Some companies will fail because they don't invest in safety. Some companies will succeed and they'll have more opportunities because of those companies that didn't take employee happiness and employee feelings of safety and reputation seriously. It's a real opportunity for an ethical, empathic company to capitalize on genuine, not fake, investments in safety. And so COVID is the perfect example of this kind of wicked problem dynamic that actually crosses a lot of other kinds of problems too.
I agree. And I think that's an amazing example to bring forward to people to show why it is that we really do need to think it through. But I also, what I loved about the example that you shared is you can overdo something or you can do it in the wrong way. And so you really have to kind of figure out, I mean, you have to even know from your employees, what's going to make you want to even come back? I mean, there's actually another dynamic in here that has nothing to do with safety that is causing some small business owners some real grief right now with reopening. And that is, at least in the US, I don't know about other places overseas, but with a lot of small businesses, the employees are saying to their leaders, I make more money on unemployment.
Oh my
gosh.
care.
I don't care how much it'll be safe for me to come back. I'm going to get my extra $600 a week until July 31st or whatever date the U.S. government, because I can make more money staying at home. And so there's this whole other intervening variable.
There is, and this actually gets into some stuff. And, we talked about this last time. Alvin Toffler said we'd all have 3-day weeks. And then, instead of 3-day weeks, we have bullshit jobs, right? And so you guys can connect the dots on that one. If you like.
But I'm just letting you know that there's more to this than meets the eye. Well, what Robert then follows up with is he says, do we call this then business literacy? Linda Larson Kemp says, do we call it wisdom literacy? Kenya adds, this is all about motivation. I really, and Robert comes back and says, are you talking about your SMART model? And I think we're talking about lots of different things here.
So just to real comment on that real quick, I'd like to have a coherent name around it so that we avoid the fragmentation. And I'll be front and center, hand on my heart, decision intelligence is not the best word for things. But I promise you, if we all pick different words for it, we're going to lose an important synergistic opportunity. So Linda, I'm delighted to put wisdom in there and stuff, but I think we should all attempt, and if we have to change the name decision intelligence to something else, I'm open to that, but there's just enough water under the bridge that maybe we don't want to do that. I don't know. But it'd be good if we could all be under the same umbrella, and then we could identify these as sub-disciplines within it. So that we can get that critical mass going, so that we can get that feedback loop happening.
Well, and what so I want to stay with that for a second as we're closing up, because I think that this is really, really important. To me, the way I look at it is that decision intelligence is actually a subset of something else. That decision intelligence is a subset of a bigger thing. The reason I call it data literacy 2.0, it's kind of like what you said about we can't ignore the data. I'm not about to ignore terms that already have.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I don't. That's fine.
But there's an enterprise core competence that has to be worked on too. And we're talking about how do we bring people together and individually on an individual level to give them this competence. But I do a lot of work in terms of transforming companies as large as even 1 million people. And there's an enterprise piece to this that needs to be expressed and pulled out that supports decision intelligence. That's what I keep saying to people. There's something under there so that the whole enterprise, because here's what I'd like to see. This is my dream for you. Okay, maybe it's a collective dream that we have. I'd like to see decision intelligence be in the DNA of every single person. And in order for it to be in the DNA of every single person, it has to be embedded into the DNA of organizations where it's not even thought about. And so for me, there's this underbelly piece that we need to work on. Now, what do we call this bigger thing? I don't know. I'm not wedded to terms either, but I really do like the term decision intelligence, and only because of what you said earlier. Some of the really big companies about a year ago started coming out with reports, and these are tech companies that say building the intelligent organization, building the intelligent enterprise. And that's why I like the link. So with
Mm-hmm.
decision intelligence, because I think they would get that. It's
Because the leaders in that organization and all the way down to the non-leaders, everybody's making decisions every day. And so this is DI is the formal structure that stitches those decisions together in a way that they work synergistically and can be really great. And if I could just add a really important point, it used to be computers were mysterious and then we got PCs. Well, today AI is mysterious and DI is mysterious. And what's going to happen, I agree with what your vision so much, that it's going to be ubiquitous. We're all going to be talking in terms of actions and outcomes. We're going to talk about responsibility and authority in terms of these mental models and how we have to keep those aligned. And, I think there's a really exciting opportunity here to go a place we've never been before.
yeah,
And so that's why the book is, Decision Intelligence for a Better World. And I'm building what I built. I had COVID a few weeks ago and I started coughing and coding every day. I built a video game like front end to the whole thing so everybody can understand it.
Take that a step further, and then we're going to wrap up.
Actions on the left, outcomes on the right, people running around on the inside with COVID particles flying out of them. And as you move the actions, you can immediately see what the impacts are on the COVID people as they're running around to help you make decisions.
So people should reach out to you if they'd like to learn more about that, correct?
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Okay, and they can reach out to you on LinkedIn, at Quintella. Where would you like them to reach out?
My Quintellia email is probably best. Lorien.pratt@quintellia.com.
Perfect.
QUANTELLIA. Or you can do lorienpratt.com, which is where my blog is.
Yeah, and because there's two different websites, correct?
There are. That's right.
We have questions that we didn't get to.
Sorry.
How do we prevent the next catastrophic change from Paul and things? But I'm going to leave those maybe for another time when we have a conversation. So this is the book.
Let's do it again. Thank you for promoting me. I like the shout out.
Yeah, it's been a great hour. I don't know about you. The time has gone really fast.
Yeah, it's really great. Thank you. I want to work with you more. This is so awesome. Our brains are like in good places. Or maybe it's like this. I don't know.
It doesn't matter. They meld together. And thank you for the compliment. And I enjoyed having you today as my guest. For those of you who have joined us today, we would love if you would share the video of this with others. There'll be a tape that'll be available on LinkedIn when it has all the comments on it. And then this will also be up on YouTube almost within like the next 10 minutes because it's being simultaneously streamed there on Level Up with Lori, which is a playlist that I have. And this is episode 12. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us, and please stay safe.
Very honored to be here. Thank you so much.